The story starts at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A professor named Gerald Lambeau is teaching a mathematics class. At the end of his lecture, he tells his graduate students that he will write a very difficult math problem on the board outside the class. Whoever solves it will have their name written on the MIT Tech. He also motivates his students by mentioning that past students who tackled that question included leading mathematicians. Because that question is difficult, Professor Gerald gives them until the end of the semester to solve it. The lecture is over. We see Will Hunting, a janitor at MIT, looking at the math problem that Professor Gerald wrote. Will goes home later and tries to solve that equation on the bathroom mirror. The next day, when he is alone in the hallway, he takes a piece of chalk and writes the answer to the problem that Professor Gerald had prepared for his students. Will enjoys spending his time outside of work by drinking and hanging out with his friends, Chucky, Billy, and Morgan. One day, while watching a kid's baseball game, Will sees a guy who used to bully him in school. Later, he and his friends approach that guy and start a fight. In the end, Will overcomes his bully and defeats him thoroughly. His friends hold him back. While the police try to control him, he attacks an officer. This leads to his arrest. Professor Gerald learns from his students that they have solved the math problem. He quickly goes to check if someone has really solved his question. He asks some of the students if they solved it, but he feels confused when none of them say who actually solved the question. His next class fills up quickly because everyone is curious about who the mysterious math genius really is. Professor Gerald asks the person to come forward and claim their prize. The entire class stares at each other, waiting for someone to step up. Since no one has claimed to solve his question, Professor Gerald informs his students that he has created another math problem. This new problem took him 2 years to solve. Professor Gerald has set up a challenge, but he doesn't know who the anonymous math genius is. Will gets out of jail and quickly starts solving the problem. At the same time, Professor Gerald steps out of his office and notices Will writing on the board. He attempts to confront Will, believing that he is simply graffitiing on the board. When Will sees him coming, he runs away. Later, Professor Gerald walks back and sees that Will has actually solved the problem. It took Will 2 years to do this. He now knows the true identity of the mysterious math genius. After work, Will meets his friends and they go back to a bar to have some drinks. Chucky sees a couple of beautiful ladies. He goes up to them and starts flirting. Chucky tells the girls a lie. He claims that he is in the same class as them to impress them. At that moment, a man interrupts him and asks which class he actually means. Chucky responds by saying history. The man is in the same class as those girls, so he knows that Chucky is lying. He attempts to embarrass Chucky by asking him what he thinks about historical topics. Chucky, who is not a history student, remains quiet. Will steps in for his friend and begins his debate with the man by presenting facts and sharing his own thoughts. The man responds with something, but Will interrupts him and finishes his whole sentence. Then, he calls him out for repeating a passage exactly from a book. Will laughs at that guy for spending thousands of dollars on education, which he got for free at a public library. After feeling embarrassed by Will, the man walks away from that place. Later, a girl named Skylar approaches Will and gives him her phone number. Skylar was impressed by Will's earlier display of intelligence. She asked him to call her so they could go out for drinks in the future. Will later show that number to the guy who was trying to act smart. At the same time, Professor Gerald has been looking for the janitor who figured out his difficult math problem. After asking a few people, he finally gets Will's contact information. He arrives at the court hearing for Will, who is involved in a case of assaulting a police officer. Will defends himself in the case. However, the judge informs him that he has many previous cases of petty theft and assaults. The judge states that he cannot ignore everything Will has done. He gives Will jail time and sets bail at $50,000. Will is sent to prison. There, he meets Professor Gerald, who has a proposition for him. He informs Will that he has talked to the judge and is prepared to grant him a pardon. However, Will needs to agree to 2 conditions. Will must take the mathematics class with Professor Gerald as the first condition. The second condition is that he must receive counseling. Will laughs at the idea of seeing a therapist. However, to avoid jail time, he has no choice but to agree to all the conditions set before him. Soon, he begins taking a mathematics class with Professor Gerald. The professor is amazed and proud of Will's intelligence. Next, he needs to see a therapist for counseling. However, no matter how many therapists he visits, Will won't open up and even makes jokes about them. He reads their books the night before and makes fun of them during his counseling sessions. As a final option, Professor Gerald seeks help from his old friend, Maguire, who currently teaches psychology at a community college. Sean initially claims he doesn't have time for this. However, Professor Gerald insists that he should help Will. He believes Will is a genius, and Sean's guidance can help Will reach his full potential in life. Sean finally agrees and meets Will. During his first therapy session, Sean requested that Professor Gerald and his assistant leave the room. Similar to his past therapist, Will starts to joke about Sean's collection of books. Sean understands that Will is using a defense mechanism and is intentionally trying to provoke him. So, Sean stays calm and talks to Will normally, without asking about his life. Will then notices a painting that Sean painted himself. Will looks at the painting and quotes some art books. He makes a few incorrect assumptions about Sean's life. Sean doesn't react to Will's insults again. However, when Will mentions his wife, Sean becomes a bit irritated. Will understands that Sean's vulnerability is his wife, so he continues to mention her. He wanted to know if Sean's wife was being unfaithful. Sean loses control and grabs Will by the throat. He tells Will to always respect his wife and never be disrespectful, and Will steps outside, thinking he has once again succeeded in breaking a therapist. Professor Gerald noticed Sean's mood and thought he wouldn't want to have more sessions with Will. However, to everyone's surprise, Sean requested to continue his sessions with Will starting next week. After his counseling session, Will goes out on a date with Skylar. During their date, Will discovers that Skylar comes from a wealthy family and is attending Harvard. They quickly become friends and have a great time together. At the end of their first date, they share a kiss. Will arrives at Sean's office next week. Sean asks him to come outside with him. Sean takes Will to a park and talks with him. He tells Will that he thought a lot about what he said and his painting. After a while, he realized that Will is just a kid who doesn't know what he's talking about. Sean tells Will that, just like he cannot make assumptions about someone else's life by reading a few art books, he cannot understand Will's problems simply because he has a degree in psychology. Sean understands that Will doesn't want to talk because he's afraid of what he might say. However, at some point, Will need to start speaking. Otherwise, he will miss out on the best things in life. Will returns to his life, where his friend Chucky picks him up and drives him to their job at a construction site. He calls Skylar. However, he is afraid to talk to her. During his third therapy session with Sean, Will remains silent, and Sean does too. They remain quiet for the entire hour. The fourth session begins in a similar way, with Will not saying anything. However, out of boredom, Will decides to tell a joke to Sean. Sean took the chance to ask if he has a girlfriend. Will then tells him about Skylar. He explains that he hasn't been in contact with her since their first date. Sean asked why. Will replies that he feels Skylar is too good for him. He thinks that if he continues talking to her, it will just ruin everything. Sean then tells him that no one is ever too good or perfect. Everyone has flaws. What matters most is whether that person is perfect for you. To make the message clearer to Will, Sean shares a story about his wife. She is the most beautiful person he has ever seen, and he fell in love with her. Interestingly, she used to fart in her sleep. This alters the entire mood in the room. Will and Sean begin to laugh a lot. Right now, they are getting closer, and Will is starting to feel comfortable around Sean. Sean tells Will not to believe that Skylar is too good for him as the session comes to a close. He should just ask if they will be happy together. Will is so focused on what Sean just said that he needs a reminder that their session is over. Encouraged by Sean's words, Will goes to Skylar's dorm and asks her out again. Skylar says she wants to go out with him. However, she has a complicated problem to solve. This could take her hours or even days. Will can't wait any longer to see her, so he solves the problem on a napkin and hands it to her. Skylar and Will are ready for their second date, with no worries holding them back. Skylar asks Will about his family. Will lies to her, saying that he has 12 brothers. Skylar asks Will to share the names of all his brothers. Will responds by listing 12 random names in order. Skylar doubts if Will is telling the truth. She asks him to say them all again. Being the genius he is, Will repeats the names in the correct order. He meets Sean at his next therapy session. He asks Sean if he has ever regretted meeting his wife. After all, she passed away, and he was left with a lot of pain to handle. Sean answers his question by sharing the story of how he met his wife. He says he first saw his wife while waiting in line with his friends to get tickets for an iconic baseball game. Will feels excited because he thinks Sean saw the game live in the audience instead of watching it on TV. He asks about the moment, and Sean shares all the details of that game. However, Sean then admits that he only watched the game later on TV. It's like he left his friends to go on a date with a girl he had just met, who would eventually become his wife. Will cannot believe that Sean gave up on a historical game just to spend time with a girl. Let's return to Will's question. Sean says he never regretted not watching that game live. He has no regrets about meeting his wife and having her in his life, even if it was just for a few years. While they were together, Skylar asked Will to introduce her to his friends and family. Will is still not telling her the truth about his life. However, he agrees to introduce her to his friends, even though he is hesitant. Skylar, Will, and his friends are at a bar. Skylar appears to enjoy being with his friends. She has a great time with them and tells a few jokes, which makes everyone laugh. At the same time, Professor Gerald asked Sean how Will was doing. Sean says that Will has started to open up slowly. However, he will need more time before he feels fully comfortable talking about his life and why he is afraid to trust anyone. Professor Gerald shares that he has been setting up job interviews for Will at leading mathematics institutes. Once Will overcomes his mental challenges, nothing will hold him back from making a name for himself in the mathematics field. Sean argues that they shouldn't decide Will's life for him and should support his choices. However, Professor Gerald insists that he won't allow Will's talent to be wasted. Will doesn't want to take that job, so he sends his friend Chucky to the interview instead of himself. One night, while they were talking about their lives, Skylar asked Will if he would move to California with her. When Skylar expresses her desires, Will begins to feel anxious and states that he cannot move out with her. Skylar asked why he is afraid to commit to her and why he never tells her the truth. She mentions that Will lied to her about having 12 brothers. Will completely loses his cool after being called a liar. He tells her that he was an orphan. He spent most of his life moving from one foster parent to another. He also shares with her that he was abused and beaten by his foster father. Skylar begins to cry and tells Will that she wants to be with him and help him. However, Will pushes her away, saying he doesn't need anyone's help. Will clearly has a fear of abandonment. He believes that anyone he loves will leave his life. Skylar cries, saying she really loves him and will not leave him. However, Will lies, claiming he doesn't love her back. He walks out, leaving Skylar to cry alone in her room. Will agrees to go to a job interview after Professor Gerald persuades him. Will arrives at the interview but does not try to get the job. During his therapy session with Sean, he is asked who he trusts the most in his life. Will responds that it is Chucky. Sean says he gets it. Chucky will sacrifice himself for Will, but he won't grasp his profound emotions. Sean asks how he plans to earn a living. Will replies that he'll work as a construction worker in Boston for the rest of his life. Sean talks to Will about his fear of stepping outside his comfort zone. He explains how this fear can prevent Will from living his best life. Sean doesn't make him take the job that Professor Gerald has planned for him. Instead, he asks Will what he truly wants to do in his life. Will says that he wants to be a shepherd. Since Will isn't serious, Sean asks him to leave the office. He says he doesn't want to waste his time if Will is not going to be honest. Will becomes angry and starts shouting at Sean. Sean, once again, asks him what he wants to do in his life. Will remains quiet and does not respond, so Sean asks him to go. Before Skylar leaves for California, Will calls her to say goodbye. Skylar tells Will that she loves him, hoping to get back together. Will smiles, but he is too afraid to say it back. He worries that it will only lead to heartbreak. Will talks to Chucky and tells him that he doesn't want to get a job. He also mentions that he broke up with Skylar. When asked what he wants to do for the rest of his life, Will says he plans to live in Boston forever. He wants to be neighbors with Chucky and work with him in construction. After hearing his answer, Chucky decides to be honest with him. He tells Will that it hurts him to see his friend waste his life when there is so much more he can achieve and be happy. Chucky has just one wish. Every day, when he comes to pick up Will at his house, he wishes Will were not there. Chucky hopes that Will leave his terrible life and begin doing something to make it meaningful. At the same time, Professor Gerald is having a discussion with Sean. He is expressing his frustration about not being able to convince Will to find a job and use his intelligence for something meaningful in his life. Sean believes that they should not hurry Will into making important life decisions when he is uncertain about what he wants to do. He explains that Will fears being abandoned. As a result, he pushes people away before getting too close. Sean believes they should support Will in whatever he chooses to do and not pressure him into getting a job that he might end up disliking. However, Professor Gerald disagrees with this. He tells Sean not to let Will believe that it's acceptable for him to ignore his intelligence and live his life as a failure. Their differing views lead to a heated argument. Professor Gerald accuses Sean of being jealous of his success and achievements. Sean tells him that he is not a failure because he never chose to be like him. At that moment, Will walks in and hears what they are talking about. Professor Gerald leaves the room to start the therapy session. Sean has a file that contains pictures of Will's body. The pictures show bruises from the beating he received from his foster father. Will asks if he has seen anything like that before. Sean reveals that his father was an alcoholic and used to beat him and his mother when he was a child. When Will hears Sean's story, he thinks about his foster father. Sean stands in front of Will and says that what happened to him was not his fault. Will nods in agreement, but Sean insists that it wasn't his fault. Will answers that he knows it's not true. However, Sean keeps repeating that Will was never at fault for what happened to him. Will starts to cry and pushes Sean away. Sean tells him again that the abuse he faced as a child was not his fault. Will finally gives into his feelings and hugs Sean. He cries deeply while holding Sean close in his arms. He is finally ready to let go of his past and move forward in his life. He informs Sean that he will take one of the jobs that Professor Gerald has arranged for him. With this, his final therapy session with Sean comes to an end. Will asks if he can keep in touch with him. Sean replies that he is always there for him and encourages him to follow his heart. Will hugs Sean before saying a final goodbye. Chucky, Billy, and Morgan give him a car as a gift for his 21st birthday. The car isn't brand new. However, Will is happy with the gift because it's from his best friends. At the same time, Professor Gerald approaches Sean and says sorry for his previous comments. Sean and his friend make up, and Sean shares that he is going on a world tour. As Sean packs his luggage, Will drives to his house and watches him prepare for his trip. Will walks to the front door. He places a letter in Sean's mailbox before driving away. Chucky goes to pick up Will at his house. He knocks on the door. There is no answer. He looks through the windows and notices that Will is not at home. Chucky smiles when he sees that Will has finally made a decision about his future. Sean receives the letter that Will left behind. Will writes in the letter that he is not accepting the job. Instead, he is going to California to meet Skylar. Sean smiles and returns to his house. The movie ends with Will heading back to reunite with Skylar.